Welcome to Unit 2, Lesson 9. Today we're going to be looking at bar graphs, and we'll be using decimals to represent information on a bar graph. Before we get started on using decimals in a bar graph, we should probably review what a bar graph is. And here you have 4 examples of different bar graphs. And our first example is an example that's showing the heights of students or people on the bottom of the bar graph. It shows you exactly who these people are. And on the left-hand side, where your numbers are located, these are the heights in centimeters. Heights in centimeters, it says here. Individual heights is the title. These must be the names, and it says here names of all the people that we're measuring. So Melissa has, or is about 149 centimeters tall, and Jane's about 163 or 2. We have to do a little guesstimation there. The reason why we have to guesstimate is because the numbers over here aren't in numerical order. They're going from 135 to 140. And the pattern in which they're using is called the interval. The interval is the pattern. So you could probably figure out the pattern pretty easily, going from 135 to 140. If you can't figure out the pattern, then you can use a trick I've always used, which is subtract the first 2 numbers in the pattern and see if there is a pattern there. So 140 minus 135 is 5. So are we going by 5s? 135, 140, 145, 150. Of course, we're going by 5s. So the interval that we're using is 5. And that's important to note because the interval can be different on different graphs, but they have to be the same throughout the same graph. So every time we go from one number to another here, the interval has to be the same. We must be skipping 5 every time. If you're changing the interval, then the graph is no good. So on some of these, we'll have to guesstimate. Like Jane, we'd have to guesstimate. That's probably about 162. It's probably not, it looks like it's not halfway to 165, and halfway would be 162 and a half. So we're about 162. And that's what you would have to do with all of these. So let's take a look at another graph. On this graph, I would like you to be able to tell me what the intervals are. What intervals the decimals are going in. In other words, find the pattern and tell me what interval these numbers are going off of. Hopefully you saw that they are going by 2/10 because they're starting at 0, going to 2/10, then to 4/10, then to 6/10. And you can see the pattern develop. You can hear it. Or you could subtract the first 2 numbers, 4/10 minus 2/10, which will get you 2/10. Tells you the difference between the first 2. And the graph has to be the same throughout. So if you can just find the difference between the first 2, you'll know the interval. So the intervals are going by 2/10 here. Well, let's see if you can find the interval on the next graph. That's all I want you to find here is what is the interval? Again, you can see on the left-hand side that you can take any 2 numbers in sequence, even the top 2 numbers, and see what the interval is. But going from the bottom, notice the bottom doesn't have to start with 0. In this case, there's no data to be represented that's less than 47 and a half. So they started it with the minimum amount. In fact, they could have started it at actually 48. That's the smallest amount the Hispanics show. But the point here is that you don't have to start at 0. You can start at any number you want, but the intervals have to be the same after that. So if you're going from 47 and a half to 48, then to 48 and a half, then 49, 49 and a half, you can see that we're going by a half each and every time. 0.5 represents a half. You could also subtract 58 and a half, or any 2 numbers in sequence, 58 and a half minus 58, which will get you a half. So 0.5 is our intervals. This is the pattern or the interval that they are using to set up this bar graph. And don't forget that this also means that in between 58 and 58 and a half. In between that is some very small intervals that have to add up to 58 and a half. So each line or each interval in between 58 and 58 and a half, this would have to be 58.1, 58.2, 58.3, 58.4, and then 58.5. So each interval inside is going to be 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and so on. There are numbers that represent the space in between. You have to know what they are in case your bar graph winds up being somewhere in between 58 and 58 and a half. All right, so our final bar graph that we can look at to try to find our intervals is this one. And we're showing scores in reading and writing on this. And we have the mean, which is another word for average. And we're using decimals on the left, and I would like you to find the intervals that they're using. Also, pay attention again. We're not starting with 0. We're starting with 52.1. We're starting with a number less than any of the data that we're representing. Our first data that we're representing is somewhere right around here. In fact, could you tell me what that number is? So we're going from 52 and 2/10 to 52 and 3/10 to 52 and 4/10 to 52 and 5/10. So obviously we're going by 1/10 each time. And if that's the case, we're going by 1/10 each time, then in the middle between 52 and 2/10 and 52 and 3/10 must be 9/100. So we must have 9 lines here, 8 lines to represent that. And our first number would be 52 and 21/100, then 52 and 22/100, 52 and 23/100, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. We need one more blue line, 15 and 29, 52, sorry, and 29/100. Add one more tenth to that and you get 52 and 3/100. So in between here is a bunch of smaller intervals that are not shown in the bar graph, but you have to know that they're there in case you have a bar like this red one here. This red bar doesn't land right on the number 52 and 2/10. It lands really around 52 and 22/100. So it's important to know the intervals, and it's important to know what is in between them. All right, using the knowledge that you have now, and the knowledge you've probably already had in the past, you're going to answer your questions on page 55. Number 1, what is the length of a bark beetle? Well, that's easy enough to check. We have a graph over here on the right-hand side. And we have bark beetle right here on the bottom. We're measuring the lengths of bark beetles in centimeters. We're starting with 0 because there's some animals that have that measure very small. So we need to start there. And we're moving in increments of, I'll let you figure that out, the intervals that we're using on the side here. But bark beetle doesn't land on an actual number, so you need to know what lands what is the number that's in between 2/10 and 4/10. Our intervals are going from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 to 14. And so you must know what happens in between there in order to answer that correctly. Number 2 says, how much longer is a firefly than a bark beetle? How much longer are some key words that you should know what to do with that if you don't look on the back wall. Number 3, estimate the length of a tumblebug, and that is estimate, that means round them off in hundredths of a centimeter. So round off to the hundredths place. And number 4, the actual length of one beetle shown is 150 thousandths of a centimeter. Which beetle is that? Which beetle represents 0.1/5 or 0.15 of a centimeter? Number 5, a June bug is about 2.5 centimeters in length. About how many times as tall as the tumblebug bar would the June bug bar be? What they're saying is the June bug is larger than the tumblebug. And so how much larger, how many times longer would the bar be to represent that? Now the June bug is not on this graph, so you'll have to use your own imagination or create a graph possibly right next to it. You could put your June bug right over here and create a bar graph that would show that. Continue on and do the puzzle penguin on page 55 as well. Then you're going to move on to page 56. You're going to use all of the data that you see in page 56. All this data right here you're going to be using to solve all of the questions on this page. In the first box over here, it says use the box to the right to make a list that shows each mass rounded to the nearest hundredth of a milligram. So you're going to use your rounding skills to round each of these off to the hundredths place. I'm going to see underlines and arrows and input your answers over here. There are a few questions underneath that, 8 through 11, that you will use this data for to answer. You'll be comparing decimals using the skill we've learned in this unit as well. Then you will be taking all that data that you created up there and you will be applying it to this bar graph. The bar graph has been written for you and created for you already. You have the intervals over here. You can figure out what that is. And you're now going to create bar graphs. It says make a bar graph to show these masses rounded to the nearest hundredth. You've already rounded them, so now go and create bar graphs for each one of these. Make sure your bar graphs have separation between them, that there's space between each bar. Complete question number 12, and you will be finished with this lesson for the day.